chemicals burn in my bloodstream, fading out again. I feel the chemicals burn in my bloodstream. So tell me when it kicks in. For a lover, thought I'd find her in a bottle. God, make me another one. I'll be feeling this tomorrow. And Lord, forgive me for the things I've done. I was never meant to hurt no one, and I saw scars upon a broken-hearted love. Oh no, no, don't leave me lonely now. If you loved me, how would you never learn? Crimson in my eyes, another one can free my mind. This is how it ends. I feel the chemicals burn in my bloodstream, fading out again. I feel the chemicals burn in my bloodstream. So tell me when it kicks in. So tell me when it kicks in. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. And I saw scars upon him, broken-hearted, and I saw scars upon him, broken-hearted, and I saw scars upon him, broken-hearted.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Townsend. I'm the chair of the Auckland branch of the Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of Te Kahu Whaihanga NZIA. It is tradition that the international guest on the National Awards jury presents this free public lecture, sponsored generously today by APL and of course with the ongoing support of David Waters. This year, that person is Patrick Kennedy of Melbourne practice Kennedy Nolan, and this year Patrick will talk to the topic of how to be an architect now. Following Patrick's presentation, Caro Robertson will host a Q&A. So I now hand you over to Patrick and welcome him here to present his lecture.
Thanks everyone, and to the New Zealand Institute of Architects for giving me this opportunity to speak in Aotearoa. Okay. So, in Australia, we like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are speaking. And so I'll do that today in New Zealand. I want to acknowledge the mana whenua of this place, the Ngāti Whatua Orakai, where we're all gathered. Sorry, I've got a bit of a dodgy thing. Here we are. And in the Maori tradition, I will tell you that I'm from the lands of the Wurundjeri, people of the Kulin Nation, from Naarm, which is more commonly known as Melbourne. And most of the projects I'll be showing you tonight are also on the Wurundjeri lands. I'll tell you if they're not. So I'm conscious of the generosity of the New Zealand architects in hosting this lecture, because it invites fellowship with the Australian profession, and it recognises what we have in common, and it celebrates that. And importantly, this dialogue also allows Australian architects to explore the things which are unique to this country, to learn from you, and along the way to share our own uniqueness. This opportunity to speak today comes after an earlier invitation to take part in your National Architecture Awards jury, which I participated in July and August. And I should acknowledge at this point that participation is an enormous privilege for an Australian architect, and it's highly valued by Australian colleagues. I was invited to join this year's jury by convener Caro Robertson, the irrepressible director of innovative, optimistic and talented spacecraft architects. Also invited by Caro were Julie Stout, revered gold medalist, much loved teacher and partner at Mitchell, Stout and Dodd, and Ari Stevens from Athfield Architects, a man well known in the profession for his talent and his intelligence and his sensitivity. The most impactful part of the national jury is the nearly 2 weeks that the jury spends together visiting shortlisted projects across the country. Obviously involving a lot of travel, this time together naturally also means in-depth conversations about architecture, its place in society and culture, and all of the very many intersecting aspects of life which inform and shape our experience of it. So I'd also like to extend special thanks to Katie Tomlinson and Joe Bates from your institute, and also to Nick and Courtney here tonight, who facilitated this complex and exhausting itinerary so well. But I want to come back to these back-of-the-bus conversations because they were the genesis of this talk. How to be an architect now. The reason I ask this question is that I think that what is required of us is unique to the moment in time, this moment in time. But the answer to this question tells a positive story, because I think as a profession, and despite it frequently being to our own detriment, being an architect now means trying to make a positive impact much more broadly than just the production of buildings. It's always wonderful for an architect to experience their colleagues' work, especially at the high level encountered on a national jury. But what struck me, especially on this year's jury, came not just from the buildings, but from the conversations with the architects, On every project, there was always so much more than a building. There was passion, inquiry, engagement, and a sense of responsibility from the architects. And from the clients, there was a genuine appreciation and gratitude for partnership, listening, and the impulse to be relevant, positive, useful, and helpful, and to contribute. In Australia, in the states of Victoria and New South Wales, moves are afoot to abolish the Architects Act, acts of Parliament which define and regulate what we do as a profession. The abolishment argument goes that we don't need an Act of Parliament for architects because being an architect is just a job, essentially a transactional activity with no higher purpose than just to provide services for money. In an article by an Australian critic, Elizabeth Farrelly, which I would encourage you to read, she asks, the duty of care implied by professionalism and protected with the title architect under the Act is not just about structural integrity and damp-proof bathrooms, it also includes cleaner air, better streets and more livable neighbourhoods. If our protection of the public good is not evident to the public, perhaps we should ask ourselves why not? Is it they who don't understand us or we who don't understand them? And I think Elizabeth Farrelly raises a good point, but off the back of the incredible experience in Aotearoa, listening to you and your colleagues talking about such an impressive array of excellent buildings, I actually started to feel a renewed optimism about our profession. I think as architects that we are thinking about cleaner air, better streets and more livable neighbourhoods. But I also think we're thinking about housing security, climate breakdown and reconciliation with our respective Indigenous cultures. And as if that wasn't enough, I think that as a profession, we're interested in contributing to a vibrant culture through making, interpreting and representing. As a profession, we're interested in art, music, fashion, sport and food. And we form an important part of the taste-making and connoisseurship that drives culture and identity and makes the world a good place to live in. So I want to talk about just some of the things that demonstrate what we are all doing to be an architect now. And I'll do it with some of my own projects in my practice, not because I think we're doing it better or differently than anyone else, but merely as examples. Something I see everywhere in architecture and which I think we should all be celebrating. I'm going to talk about some of the areas where architects are doing more than transacting services for payment. Areas where our professionalism means contributing to the public, where the benefits of our job are balanced with our responsibility to society. These contributions are manifold, but I will just talk about a couple. Many of you will be familiar with the Nightingale model, and of course Claire Cousins spoke about it at this very lecture last year. However, I do want to revisit it briefly because it's a great example of how our profession contributes beyond the mere provision of architectural services. What's special about the Nightingale model is that, led by Breed's Jeremy McLeod, architect recognised a problem with developer-driven multi-res housing. It was wasteful, unsustainable, energy-efficient buildings. The design decisions were led by real estate agents and marketing people. There was no sense of community. There was a short tenure. It was an average of 11 months in Melbourne. People would stay in an apartment. They were pretty poor value for money, and there was a distinct lack of housing types, options. Also, they completely excluded social housing or community housing. They were all for sale and for profit. So, Nightingale was born from an idea by architect Jeremy McLeod, and enthusiastically joined and embraced by other architects who saw that the only way to address these issues was to take on the developer's role, including the developer's financial risk, but significantly, we didn't take on the developer's profit. So this is our Nightingale, which we called Left Field. It is part of the Nightingale Village, which includes 5 other Nightingale buildings, with Claire Cousins Evergreen shown on the left here. Like all the others, it includes external circulation, which conserves energy, it's healthier and encourages incidental interaction in the communities. It has a communal roof garden, which includes a landscape design by our regular collaborator Amanda Oliver, who does all of our single residential gardens. It has a communal laundry, which frees up space in the apartments, making them cheaper, but also helping build community through shared spaces and resources. There's minimal car parking, there's car share on site, and extensive bike parking, and that also reduces the cost of the dwellings. And it takes advantage of the available public transport because they're frequently located on land which developers wouldn't want to touch on railway lines. Interiors which bring the best of our single residential practices, mine and some of the other people involved, to a typology which was previously dominated by white plasterboard and downlights. In all of the Nightingales, you will find an emphasis on amenity over the marketing bling. Indeed, a significant positive impact of Nightingale is that it has brought practices like ours, previously best known for single residential, into accessible multi-residential market, and proved that there is an appetite for colour and texture and playfulness. And I suppose most critically, Nightingale has also set new benchmarks in sustainability for this building typology. Nightingale has also put pressure on authorities to require more inclusion. Our Nightingale has 20% blind tenure for social housing and includes all ages and diverse household profiles. And despite all the fears of this, it is a highly functioning community. Inclusionary zoning, which means including social housing components, is now on the agenda with governments in Australia, and I think the Nightingale housing model has very definitely contributed to this shift. So I guess the moral of this story is not that architects should become developers. Few of us want to do that, nor am I suggesting that Nightingale is the answer or that it is perfect. Its significance is that it has moved the dial when the dial stubbornly was not moving. And this is why I'm using Nightingale as my first example of what architects do, which is more than services for fees, because it's an example where architects are using our skills and our training for the public benefit and a commitment to help. The best part of it is that by leading by example, when we were not able to influence our clients in our traditional role as architects, Nightingale has completely changed developer-led projects and raised consumer expectations. Now the real estate and marketing people are telling us to activate the ground planes and provide communal spaces and embed sustainability and make warm domestic spaces like it was their idea in the first place. But this is a good outcome because there is a measurable concrete shift. Apartment buildings which are now more sustainable, more domestic, more community focused and more diverse in their dwelling types on offer. So our work with Nightingale has led to other projects where practices like ours, who have traditionally been pigeonholed as only capable of single high-end residential, can now bring fresh approaches to domestic spaces and interiors, sensitively designed communal areas. We can challenge accepted notions of urban design and bring new interpretations to heritage contexts through abstraction and detail, and bring architectural thinking to public housing and giving dignity to residents and contributing to the city. In Australia, most often when anything happens in a public setting, it is considered appropriate or necessary to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country, as I did at the start of this talk. Recently at a talk in Melbourne, Gerard Reinmuth of Australian Practice Terroir was reflecting on the acknowledgement of country as he told us that in Denmark, where his office also has an office, it is customary for architects to, when speaking publicly about their buildings, to acknowledge the carbon of that building, to state the carbon footprint of any building they're going to discuss publicly. And I raise this because I think the acknowledgement of country that we do in Australia and that you do here, I think it's a really important way of architects being more publicly spirited beyond just transacting for fees. And then this example in Denmark is yet another example of how architects are trying to address this problem, this climate emergency that we're having. So that's something that architects are doing. And you'll all know about Architects Declare movement, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have joined this declaration. So this is a really authentic movement, and it reflects genuine concern in our profession, if not panic, about the state of the climate. But importantly, it is also a commitment to address it. Joining movements like Architects Declare, as well as public demonstrations and buying carbon credits on flights and being careful with recycling are important, but only if they're backed up with real action. And the 10 aims of Architects Declare are a concrete guide, which many of us have signed up to, and these are serious commitments. Architects Declare is one example among many of our commitment as a profession to the public good outside of a transactional work for services model. Whilst on the national jury, I saw evidence of this commitment everywhere in New Zealand, and what struck me was the way architects were leading clients, even when those clients were already committed to sustainability outcomes. One of the most important ways we can affect change, and one that is specifically referenced in architects declare is through collaboration. And there's a theme here. Working solo, as we often do, it feels hard to make an impact. But working together, things start to happen. And I would say that is the truth for Kennedy Nolan. We are not leaders in any of these areas, but we're very eager or enthusiastic followers. And I think that's what we can all do. So I kept seeing collaboration in action while on the national jury in New Zealand, in projects of all types and scales. And today I'm going to illustrate an example of my own experience of collaboration through a little project we did in Melbourne, which addresses point 6 of the Architects Declare, which is about reuse of existing buildings. So I'm just going to... We regularly collaborate with Ross Harding of Finding Infinity. He's a sort of Svengali guru of sustainability, and today I want to show you a sustainable retrofit project, which was a collaboration facilitated by Ross. You can see him here pictured in the blue Adidas tracksuit, which he has in every colour, including a black one, which he adds a black tie to for black tie functions. And this is the team that came together for this project. It consists of Ross and his colleague Will from Finding Infinity. They're the sustainability consultants, but also the progenitors of this project and the people who have documented and promoted its findings. The money, which is such an important part of this project, came from Triple, which is a family company focused on ethical investment, and this is Jake Milgram from Triple. And it was built by Wilderness Building Company, and so these are builders with a heartfelt commitment to sustainable construction practices. They're responsible for the use of materials, and they manage and minimise construction waste and packaging. So Kaya, who leads Wilderness, is on the right, with his colleagues Pat on the left and Rika in the middle. Emma, from Resin Project Management, so project managers were also involved in this, was a professional with aligned values. And I think this is another thing, is actually there are a lot of people out there who want to contribute in all areas. And part of our role as architects, because we're always the consultant in the middle, is bringing them all together. But they do exist even in the evil project management world. And as Kennedy Nolan as architects were superlatively represented here by my business partner, Rachel Nolan. The project was part of a wider idea called a new normal, a commitment by a group of Australian architects, originally in Melbourne, but now in Sydney and in Perth, facilitated by Ross and Finding Infinity, to make cities carbon positive by 2030. A new normal started with aspirations and ideas, but it is now informing real projects, and I would encourage you all to look it up. A new normal is another collaboration, led by Ross, but including a collection of prominent Melbourne architects and allies in engineering, construction and media. Once again, a new normal is not something we led, but it was a vehicle for us to contribute. And much like with Nightingale, it takes leaders, exceptional, dogged, sometimes little fanatical people, to dream up these schemes. But the way they can have an impact is when egos get put aside and people can join in and affect change. And I think that's another thing. The leaders, that is such a key and important role, but actually the delivery side that most of us do all the time is so important, because the ideas don't happen unless, all of us workhorses get in behind it and actually make it. So to our new normal project, which addresses point 6 of the Architects Declare. And this is the building we were retrofitting and as we found it. Our aim was to do the least possible to make the most impact. So this is not a glamorous architectural project. And this is Finding Infinity's program of the environmental aspirations. In the words of Ross, they are a grand total of a whole lot of boring bits, but they're very important bits. A lot of the environmental bits help create a lovely home, because the insulation, airtightness and new windows keep the apartments warm and quiet, and increased performance keeps the bills low. And this is it complete, not specially different, but it's significantly different in operation. It was renamed Willem Narang, and by and with the permission of the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri, and means place to reflect. It is Australia's first plus energy retrofit of an apartment block. It is a modest project, but the principal aim of it is to serve as a prototype. As I said, it doesn't look so different, but this is what we did. Doors and windows were replaced with recycled plastic double glazed units and combined with an airtight lime-based paint. Airtightness was massively improved. We got everything on Finding Infinity's initial diagram, bar the external blinds, with no thanks to the fire engineer. So this felt pretty good. We didn't manage to get additional storage for our tenants, which is a problem, and we didn't manage to solve the disability access. But in general, I think it was a big plus. So doing the least possible meant a brutally pragmatic approach. But despite this, we were able to achieve an 80% reduction in bills, an 80% reduction in embodied carbon emissions compared to constructing an equivalent new building, a 35% reduction in mains water, improved comfort, and we appointed Homeground, an ethical real estate business where 100% of profits go to helping end homelessness, and where 2 of the apartments are rented out below market to support those needing help to enter the rental market. Also, on this building, there is a commitment to paying the rent to traditional owners. So once again, I would encourage you to find out more about Willemnaring. Here's the website. There's quite a bit to it, and the monitoring of it is ongoing. And look, I see examples of this kind of endeavour everywhere in architecture, and I saw it all over New Zealand when I was here earlier this year, and it inspired the theme of this talk. Change, innovation, a commitment to addressing the greatest challenges humans currently face through advocacy, thought, passion, technical innovation, and frequently a good portion of sweat equity. Reflecting on our role as architects, I think that it is really the role of synthesis, understanding everyone else's role, corralling their contributions and making it all into one thing, and that one thing which should also be delightful, comfortable, and sometimes beautiful. An important part of our role at Willemnaring was literally to try and turn a sow's ear into a silk's purse, and to do this with the fewest possible resources. Architects are frequently accused of being shallow or venal because we are preoccupied by how things look. But the team at Willemnaring recognised the social importance of human occupation, our need to connect to our environments, to live in spaces which are dignified by utility and beauty. And this is not superficial work. This is work which contributes to well-being, and at its best and its most inspiring helps form our society and our culture. And of course, sustainable retrofit is just one of the countless ways that architects are addressing the climate catastrophe, from the small prototypical scale of Willemnaring up to very large projects by our colleagues in Australia and by people in this room. And the important point is that you, your colleagues, all of us are doing this work, and that by recognising that and by celebrating it, I think we're encouraged to do more. Off the back of Willemnaring, we're currently working on more projects under the banner of New Normal, including a sustainable retrofit of Graham Gunn's State Heritage listed Plumbers and Gas Fitters Union building, which we were working on with Graham, sharp and full of ideas and passion right up until his recent death last month at the age of 91. This is another interesting thing about architects, I think, is that they will work till they drop. And so Graham is a person who, he was literally on life support and he still was holding a pen. I think that's a remarkable testament to our profession. This project is also a prototype. It's an example of how to retrofit important heritage buildings and office buildings. The Plumbers Union, which is allied to the powerful Construction Union, is vitally interested in protecting the workstream of its members against constraining limits of ballooning construction costs, and also in how they're also interested in how electrification affects his gas fitting trades. So a big part of their membership is involved with gas. And so these projects necessarily incorporated some difficult conversations. Construction starts soon, and a protected building, like in terms of heritage, it's got the highest heritage rating you can have in Australia, which is on the verge of being abandoned, will now be fully accessible, have massively improved thermal comfort. It has significantly reduced operational costs and will include infrastructure to explore biogas and hydrogen as future decarbonised fuels, and providing a pathway to the job security for plumbers and gas fitters. It doesn't have natural gas now, though. The project started with Ross telling us, let's get the plumbers and gas fitters off gas, and we actually have managed to do that. Another New Normal collaboration with Finding Infinity is this multifunction public building in Brunswick, Melbourne, which currently includes an Indigenous art gallery, creative spaces for hire, maternal health services, and a park. And this complex project targets energy use, water use, energy production, circular materiality, retrofit of existing buildings on the site, and repair of country. It's approaching completion, and we have just embarked on the early stages of a new normal project with Finding Infinity, a 32-storey mass timber tower with a solar facade in Adelaide. So new normal is starting to have an impact on lots of buildings in Australia now. That's another collaboration based on shared values and an example of putting Architects Declare into action, another example of a project that we couldn't do without leaders and collaborators. So I think it's important to remember that when people are critical of architects for doing things like acknowledging country or insisting on carbon offsets on flights, and they think it's virtue signalling, and I think it's shallow and that it doesn't do anything. I think those things are really important. They're all examples of the seriousness with which we take these issues, and they are backed up with real things that we're all doing. So another issue that both your country and ours is having to grapple with is reconciliation with our First Nations people and what our part is to be part of this solution. The buildings that we saw in this year's jury were born in the Ardern years, and I observed something really remarkable which came out of that. As I understand it, the Ardern government made a serious attempt to progress Maori equality through, amongst other things, the establishment of Te Arabiti, recognition of language and culture, financial redress and apologies. But more broadly, by making New Zealand a place where recognition of Maori culture and language and acknowledgement of past injustices could be discussed, understood and expressed. So what struck me was the enthusiasm and passion with which New Zealand's architects picked this up. Everywhere we went, we heard stories, sometimes very harrowing stories, and we saw serious attempts to grapple with the impacts of colonisation, but also to recognise and celebrate Maori culture, society, language and art. And this was done through an open-hearted, open-minded engagement with mana whenua and iwi. Can you just scroll my text up a little bit, please? Significantly, I also saw our Māori architects both contributing to and leading projects, bringing authentic perspectives and knowledge to them. In Australia, we look to you to learn how to reconcile with our own beautiful Indigenous culture. And I feel really proud that our profession to note that this, as in Aotearoa, Australian architects have grasped the importance of it. We all want to learn from traditional owners. We're insisting on acknowledgement and change, and we're following the advice of our First Nations leaders. The process of reconciling with First Nations people has only just begun for Australians and was massively set back by our referendum on the voice to Parliament last year. And so as a profession, we are grappling with how to be an architect respectfully, responsibly and consciously on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. How do we address stolen land, stolen birthrights, dispossession, dislocation, lost traditions, lost languages, injustice, criminal acts against Indigenous Australians, including genocide in Tasmania, racism? What we are learning in Australia is to know the importance of country. This is helping us with this process. And this is why we have learned to acknowledge country that we're on and to recognise the traditional owners. Understanding country is vital, and it's our way to reconcile through caring for country. If we care for country, we are acknowledging the ineffable and unbreakable link between First Nations people and that land. So buildings don't need to be the centre of this, and obviously not all buildings serve Aboriginal people. Most are materially, economically and culturally unconnected. However, they all exist on Aboriginal land, and this is a way for us to honour this is to care for that land. Colonisation has transformed the landscape in Australia. The concept of land as a spiritual part of self, one inseparable from the other, is diametrically opposed to the coloniser's perception of land as a resource. But reconciliation requires us to reconcile these two ways of thinking. Actually, what we're slowly learning is that an Indigenous approach to land is really what we most need now. Increasingly, we can see that traditional land management knowledge and techniques can repair land and waterways, restore fertility, manage bushfires, be drought resistant and mitigate floods. Removing feral animals and restoring soil and native fauna improves all land, including cropping and grazing land. And Indigenous food sources can provide greater nutrition with less water and no fertilisers. So, architects are now increasingly interested in this repair. Construction is inherently additive, even destructive, but the process can involve repair of land. This project of ours is on Boonwurrung land. It was previously cleared for grazing in the early 20th century, which obliterated the coastal ecosystem. Nothing remained, and then subsequently it was subdivided and invaded by exotic weeds. But repair can take place even on a small scale. And I think this is a good lesson for us, is that everything we do can be reparative. Through weed removal, through respecting terrain, and through re-establishment of Indigenous plantings. The house is called Always, acknowledging that the land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. These projects are minuscule increments on the path to reconciliation. The significance is that in every decision about design, that decision will be improved if it understands and respects the country it's on. And there is a wider imperative to care for country because it goes hand in glove with addressing the climate catastrophe. You know, it's really interesting to note that for 60,000 years, Indigenous Australians lived in perfect balance with the land, caring for it so it could care for them. In 200 years, we've just about wrecked the joint. When I was here on the jury, I heard similar stories about Maori careful management of resources, of a symbiosis with the land, which was inherently sustainable. And I think we all need a bit of that. So not everything architects do is as serious as some of the things I've been talking about. And I want to talk about another important role that architects do which benefits society, and that is our role as tastemakers, as connoisseurs, as interpreters of the zeitgeist, our role in contributing to culture. In our practice, shown here, much of our work has been in residential architecture, where it can feel like the scope to address these big issues is limited. So I think it's important to emphasise that this is important work too, because it involves deep thinking about humans and how we live. And the work we all do ultimately influences the way all buildings are made. So I'm going to show you some of our residential projects to illustrate what we're all doing all the time, by being curious, interested, and creative, and sometimes in very small ways. I'll start off with the work we do in heritage. So New Zealand has a similar stock of post-settlement heritage buildings to Australia. So these are highly valued both for their historic and aesthetic importance. And part of our role of an architect is to design in, around and near to build heritage and interpret it to manage newness so that it's comfortable and tell a new story. This is a very complex and difficult thing which we do. We take old materials and we compose them into unfamiliar arrangements to perform new uses. We inform ourselves about vernaculars and represent them to amplify and expand on that architectural language. We use abstraction and adapt heritage imagery to contemporary uses to make buildings which speak to past traditions and distill their essence. We also deal with context in everything we're doing. With every context, we take a first principles approach to make specific buildings which consider aspect, prospect and refuge specific to their context and the aesthetic and qualitative characteristics of the surrounding neighbourhood. We think about buildings at all times of the day and night and how they can be quietly generous to the street. We take pains to understand the formal and aesthetic qualities of cities, and then we dream up new forms and aesthetics which are eccentric or idiosyncratic, but visually and aesthetically connected to the surrounding urbanism. And we make sure those places are livable. An architect challenges housing typologies to adapt to contemporary values, de-emphasising entry, placing it discreetly, and privileging privacy to the street, and privileging the living areas with scale and aspect and connection. And in a coastal context, we think about the form as a lightly perched creature, enigmatic and ultimately receding as the landscape reclaims the site. A form which conceals domestic comfort and interior richness. Another thing that we do as architects is make visual language. Architects are fascinated with buildings and the history of architecture. they read about it, they travel obsessively to look at it. It's a lifelong pursuit. And then, when a brief requires a swimming pool on a small site, we take this accumulated knowledge and experience and we make something new, which is also deeply connected to that knowledge, but somehow familiar. And using our knowledge and our passion for building crafts and techniques, we collaborate with builders to realise it. And we're adaptable, so that when a client returns from Mexico obsessed with Louis Barragan, we can adapt this reference to Western Port Bay and celebrate the inspiration, abstracting and modulating it through a design process which has to do 1,000 other things. We deploy elements of architecture when they are necessary and beautiful. A brise-soleil to manage privacy and solar gain, but also to unify a facade and give it clarity and strength. And we take this cue to generate a design sensibility which encompasses every element. Each element of a building is an opportunity for expressiveness through change of scale or abstraction. In this case, an eave, which sets up a visual language for everything else. Or in this house, where the chimney is simplified and abstracted amongst a series of complementary forms, it tells a simple story of the hearth, which is a domestic space to gather. All buildings have to do so much: provide shelter, accommodate specific and diverse uses, perform thermally, meet the planning code and the building code, manage privacy, acoustics, provide aspect, light and ventilation to the interior. They must be durable, manage a budget, and they need to be respectful of their neighbourhood. They must manage terrain and climate and infrastructure, and they've got to be conscious of the carbon footprint and energy and water use, and should consider how they are recycled. And on top of this, they should be beautiful. So synthesising all of this is the job of an architect, and it is our unique skill. It's our unique skill as a profession that, considering some or ideally all of these things, we can make a singular object, which also tells a story about who uses it, or where it is, or when it was made. A good building is more than the sum of its parts, but what is exciting about our profession is that those parts are always different, and thus so are the buildings. I also want to talk a bit about landscape, because it's such an important part of what we do. Good architecture is buildings in a balanced relationship to landscape. Balance is the important word because it implies a project-specific but critical relationship in every instance. And this is a relationship over time. I spoke earlier about the opportunities to repair country, to reintroduce indigenous plants and provide habitats for insects and animals, to restore soils and to manage water runoff, which improves as it grows. Planted roofs have great thermal qualities and embed buildings in the landscape. But they're expensive, and there are lots of other opportunities to make places for plants. It's good for cities, reducing heat island effects, creating habitats essential for a highly functioning ecosystem, but also acknowledging the fundamental human need for a connection to the natural world. Gardens are valued elements of domestic space, but when considered in conjunction with built form, they are also working hard, making buildings legible, identifying entry points, elevating thresholds, screening for privacy, shading for comfort. And because they change with seasons and flower and produce scent and drop their leaves and attract birds and insects and move in the wind and most wondrously grow, they make the static dynamic and joyous, and they are irresistible to humans. In our practice, we feel like the landscape, the gardens, which are mostly done with our important collaborator Amanda Oliver, are integral to both the beauty and the function that we are attempting to achieve. The balance shifting into a better place over time. It's impossible for us to imagine these houses without their gardens. And not just because they're beautiful, they are all working hard in the ways I've described. They are living elements of the architecture. And then the last element I want to discuss is the interior. Just as we see an essential balance between buildings and landscape, we also value a balanced relationship between a building and its interior. We are essentially, in our practice, 20th century in our belief that architecture starts at the edge of the site, sometimes maybe even suggesting a relationship beyond the site. And it includes the terrain and the landscape, and it goes into the building, and it includes the spatial and material experience of interiority with as much intensity as the external form. When we design a building, we are thinking of all the parts, the colours, the materials, the textures, and the way these elements interact with light, both natural and artificial. And this goes for both inside and outside. We are interested in the way interiors sound and even the way they smell. We think that memory, both individual and collective, is often generated by a sensory experience of interior, and believe that this is intensified by consideration of interior elements. Colours, textures, shadows and patterns are common materials, common memories for people, as are the smell of certain rooms or the modulation of space, going from a confined space to a larger space, for example. We are always aspiring towards a certain theatricality. Sometimes this is flamboyant or arresting, but it can also be peaceful and reflective. Theatre makes you feel things, but it can be any number of things. And so I'm going to finish on our most recently completed project, which opened last week. It's a hotel in Melbourne. I'll need some help with the scrolling on this one too. So it's a hotel in Melbourne CBD, and the largest and most complex project our practice has ever undertaken. And I want to show you this building because it is an example of synthesis. All professions are required to synthesise multiple things in their work, but I think that the practice of architecture is exceptional in the scope of synthesis required. It is interesting to note that the historical periods can be described by architectural expression. Think of Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian, or of Renaissance, Baroque, Neoclassical, Modernist, Postmodernist, all eras which can be understood visually by the architecture. Similarly, cultures can be understood architecturally. French, Pacifica, Japanese. We can picture an architecture to represent these cultures. New Zealand and Australia have distinct architectural expressions too. It's a symbiotic relationship, I think, the architecture both reflecting and influencing the time. This is an important role and we are all doing it. And I think that the reason for this symbiotic relationship is that architecture is at its best is synthesis, doing lots of things at once to make an effortless, singular thing. A pithy, detailed, distilled, uncanny image of many things. This is true of the buildings we make, but also of how we deliver them. We are mostly the only ones involved who know what everyone else is up to. The clients, stakeholders, authorities, engineers, every one of a multitude of consultants, builders, subcontractors, and building users. We're involved with all of these parties. We are looking around at other buildings, of course, but also at art, at landscapes, and fashion, and films, and lots more, and synthesising that into something. So it's a pretty special role. This building is special for us because it's our first foray into city making. We designed the building and almost all of the interiors. And we collaborated with Amanda Oliver on the garden elements, and we collaborated with a score of other people, including the brickmakers in Western Victoria who specifically made the bricks for this project. We collaborated with the builder and the trades on every element of the building. We commissioned furniture and lighting from local makers, some of whom we worked with for many years. The architectural ideas that generated the building are evident everywhere in the interiors. Intense exploration of colour, which you can see through the building. A domestic experience, which is one of the things we were really keen to imbue in this hotel, that it had some of the qualities that our single residential projects would have. The idea that you could go to a hotel and not feel you were part of a global experience, that you were experiencing something very specific and domestic in Melbourne. So this has just been photographed 2 weeks ago, so it's very new. A lot of this is new for me to look at as well. It's also a very earnest attempt at an Australian aesthetic. We're really keen to think, what does an Australian hotel look like? What does a hotel in Melbourne look like? And we spent a lot of time developing what we thought that might be. So I need some scrolling help with this too. So to round out this discussion, I want to revisit the original idea for it, how to be an architect today. Being an architect today is not easy, and it's different to any other time in history. So it's very easy to feel defeated or despondent about what we face every day. Difficult clients, regulation, always more and more, risk allocation, again, always more, cost pressures which sometimes feel insurmountable, authorities and stakeholders with small imaginations and who are sometimes confusingly openly hostile. We have to consider so much: the climate emergency, living on colonised land, population growth and housing security. And we are so aware of what everyone else is doing because we are overwhelmingly linked up via the internet. We're trying to make a living. It's hard as a business owner, if not harder as an employee. And the world is in turmoil with a lunatic in charge of the White House. But I felt inspired by my jury tour here this year because what I saw was architects and their clients and other collaborators passionately grappling with all of these things, working together, committed to solutions, optimistic about outcomes, wanting things to improve and working hard to achieve that. And it made me proud to be an architect, and it made me want to reflect on everything we do and to defend our profession. Rachel, my business partner, and I always say to us, Rachel and I, we always say to our staff, be in the world, travel, read, have fun, because the best architecture reflects life and culture, not just other architecture. Which is, of course, the limitation of AI. It is just referencing other buildings, but what makes architecture interesting and human is when it invents new ways of living, addresses external forces like climate change, engages with politics and social justice, reflects culture, and expresses dreaming, inventing and making. In the past, architecture was mostly used to project power, if you think of the pyramids of Versailles or a Gothic cathedral, and it still does, of course, but our profession has evolved into one populated with passionate people committed to understanding and interpreting and helping. When discussing this talk with Rachel, she focused on the idea of helping, the way architects so often want to help, and I think that's a nice way to think about what we do. The hard slog of our work continues next week. But right now, we are celebrating excellence at the awards this evening, an event held every year in recognition that excellence is ongoing, that it happens every year, right across the profession. So congratulations to the shortlisted architects and the winners, of course, but congratulations to all of you for the work you all do every day.
Okay, it's now my pleasure to do a couple of more little jobs. Obviously, the most important one right now is to thank Patrick for that passionate, thoughtful and optimistic reflections on how to be an architect now. That was wonderful. I'm sure you all enjoyed it, and he's now going to take a seat in a blue chair, and I'm going to invite Caro Robertson to the stage, as already indicated by Patrick, and there'll be a Q&A that I'm told will be operated via Slido up here on the screen, and you're encouraged to follow the instructions and put your questions to Patrick and Caro. And lastly, just on behalf of the Institute of Architects Auckland branch, I would like to thank you all very much for coming along today. It's been a wonderful lecture and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Cheers.
Are these on? Yeah.
On.
Kia ora koutou. You know, you answered all my questions as you talked. I can't believe you covered so much ground.
Thanks.
Yeah. I'm supposed to be getting questions, am I?
I missed a bit where I didn't know how to scroll the screen. So.
Oh my gosh. Well, I've got, that was super comprehensive. They're helping. I love that helping because we've been talking a bit about, the bizarreness of architects to the rest of the world and how they all look at you like you're tripping. Why do you care about that?
It's interesting that as a profession, if you think about it, when people describe someone who's not an architect, they say non-architect, which is, no other profession does that. They don't say, Jane's an architect and Peter's a non-architect. But we do that because it's almost like being in a cult. So, and I think this is, it's kind of our weakness in many ways, but it is this real strength, is that it has a vocation quality to it, and this desire to help. Because I'm always saying this to my staff whenever we have, staff reviews and everyone wants to pay a rise. I say, listen, you guys, you're all so smart. You could all have been a doctor, or you could have gone into finance, or you could have done any number of things and made a lot of money, but you didn't. You chose to be an architect, and it was not a great decision financially. But there's some real positives, because you actually do get to have an impact on culture and the world.
My questions, because I'm not getting any on my... Oh, yeah, no, I have got one. Okay, I'm going to ask mine first, though. So, when you consider a building and the genesis of your buildings, and then it starts getting built on site, does it surprise you as you walk through your buildings that come together? Are they...
Sometimes it surprises me, but it's never a nice feeling.
Okay. And then does it get a bit of distance, and then you're like, yeah, it did it?
No, I think normally, because of the process of designing and drawing, which is so intensive,
yeah.
By the time it emerges, I feel like I don't get surprised unless it's wrong. So.
Yeah. Well, just because your buildings read to me like three-dimensional artworks, and I've talked to you about colour before, because there's a certain bravery about getting the colour out, and I'm very much of the opinion that just give it a crack. I'm sick of beige. I don't want any more mushroom.
I think this is why a hotel's an interesting project to use colour in, because in domestic interiors or commercial, in fact most genres of architecture, people are pretty resistant to be adventurous with things like colour, because they have this fear of getting sick of it or getting tired of it, or of it dating and so on. But with a hotel, you can run this argument that you're only there for 1 or 2 nights, and so intensity is actually the name of the game. It's actually to make you feel something and remember something is the name of the game. So you can run that argument pretty successfully. But we always say to any client, it's like with colour, I don't think people regret using colour or engaging with colour. And also, it can become a kind of a joyous thing. It actually is something that embeds in memory. So actually, when you experience a colour, it can remind you of something else, and that often is a spatial thing. So it's actually a wonderful opportunity to form part of a personal or a collective memory. So we are always encouraging it. And then in terms of things dating, the idea that you're going to use white or beige or whatever because it won't date is kind of rubbish. But the idea that a building doesn't date is also sort of ghastly. The idea that a building is just so beyond time that it never feels relevant to any specific point in time is actually awful, I think. So we're always saying, you want it to date. You want it to be a depiction of a point in time. You just want it to be a really good one.
Do it doesn't make me think of Michael J. Fox. The imagination of the future. It was like trying to be timeless, but it's never timeless. It's always gloriously dated.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've got some questions. Great lecture. In terms of design with First Nations, have you ever collaborated creatively with traditional owners, bringing their ideas to the table and into the design solution?
Well, we haven't, and this is something we really want to do. It's a structural problem in Australia or in Melbourne that we have at the moment with collaboration. One of the projects I showed you, which was in Brunswick, the complex, the public building, we dealt with traditional owners, or we worked with traditional owners over some aspects of it, but because of the time frame of when they were brought in, the project was mostly sort of in place, so it felt like quite a insubstantial contribution. So we talked to them more about actually the parts that we could discuss with them. We could talk to them about the importance of colours. We could talk to them about how the landscape would reflect the particular country and some of the stories of country and the totems that were in that area. but it wasn't very substantial. So our aspiration is actually to do this work right at the start, and we have started doing that on Tati Tati country up in northwest Victoria. And this is a substantial process, and I think the part of it is that it takes a very long time. So we've started, the buildings won't emerge for probably another decade, and that is the time frame which we all have to get our heads around in order to have substantial traditional owner engagement. It's been a problem in competitions and so on now, is that traditional owners are always one of the check boxes, but they just get brought in, strapped to the mast, and then shown the side door after they've, stuck a goanna on it or something. So that is a real problem. I think people are looking for way more substantial ways to incorporate traditional owner input. But it's part of the problem solving of architecture, is that we are now trying to work out ways to do that.
From our jury travel experience, we actually made me realise how complex the treaty settlements process is and how much the initial targeting of the settlement funds have gone into commercial enterprise. And once you've got this humming commercial enterprise where you have an income stream, you can start using that to form projects. And then because they're iwi-led project, that's leading the way. From my perspective of what we saw this year, it was just, so in terms of kind of putting the cart before the horse, the funding is such a big deal. I'm not answering any questions here. Okay, so going from the lofty to the very specific, mentioned lime paint. Can you describe how this is different from other paints?
Oh, yeah, the technicalities are probably not my strong point, but it's what I understand is it's a lime-based sort of render type paint, and what it does is it has this quality where it seals up all the air gaps as well. So it's just a way of, it's like a sort of cheap way of improving the thermal envelope rather than taping everything in a passive house sort of approach. So it's not the answer to airtightness, but actually does massively improve it in old buildings.
Yeah, some of the time we think about the cultural appropriate, what am I saying? No, the landscape appropriate, climate appropriate, that's what I'm going for, of airtightness. We can do way better than we have been doing, but do we actually need to get all the way there? I noticed you had a lot of young staff in your photos. I'm wondering how those of us who are older can support younger members of our profession who are expected to design with country, mana whenua, and sustainable right from the get-go. We've been talking to the Institute of Architects, Te Hahu Whahanga, about this, so they're working on that, but what do you got to say? How do you, so I guess if you're coming from a ground of not dealing with all these complex issues, but you're in a position of leadership, how do you support your young staff to solve all the problems of the future?
Well, it's just part of a culture of inquiry. So what we can do is treat the aspiration to reconciliation seriously in our practice. So we can make time for it to discuss it. We can include it as part of every discussion that we have about design in our practice. We have staff development days. We're always including First Nations investigations in that. I don't think there's anything specific you can do. What you can do is you can encourage, or you can make the values of your practice aligned with those values. And then everything you do will inevitably include that, because it's as natural as thinking about meeting the building code. So it's just about getting the value system set up so that it's not even something you have to think about, it's just actually the way you think. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it's a tricky one.
That's a good question. So with regards to addressing climate change, I liked how you said climate breakdown. That was a much better way of describing that. And carbon accounting and carbon sequestering, have your practice considered the use of natural materials like earth and straw?
Yeah, look, we have, one of our staff did a fellowship last year, the Robert Caulfield Fellowship, and went from Denmark down to France exploring circularity, and she's got a fantastic podcast called Again and Again and Again, which I would recommend you listen to. It's really very good. and her job in our practice now is to consult all the projects in terms of incorporation of materiality. So it's part of our design process is to work out how we can incorporate these things. So we have the project, some of our projects now, one of them I showed you, uses this new material called DuraPanel, which is instead of gypsum or plasterboard, it's fully compostable. You can chop it up, put it into a mound, and it's gone within a couple of years. So we are now trying to incorporate that into our projects where we can, looking at, how it's done in all the very many varied things that architects have to think about. So it's an ongoing investigation. Every project we look at what we can include. In Australia, one of our biggest constraints is fire. So we obviously have bushfires, which are pretty brutal. They don't necessarily affect in the inner cities, but we also have paranoia about fire everywhere because we had a few apartment buildings catch on fire as well. So fire and flammability is this massive preoccupation in Australia, and so mass timber is a real challenge for us. But that's why we're working on this building in Adelaide to try and work out how to manage fire and timber, and I know a lot of the projects I saw here are using mass timber in ways which we couldn't contemplate in Australia. But I think, we're very interested to find out. So we see every project as an opportunity to try and learn a bit more.
There's a Seattle-based firm that's, just talking about the Nightingale effect. It's an architect who's gone and done fire testing of mass timber because they care so much about it. And, the risk aspect of just getting out there and being like, I'm going to, defy the consent authorities and try a new product.
But that's where you're putting your money where your mouth is, right?
Yes.
By doing the fire testing. I mean, that's basically the only way it's going to convince the fire brigade to allow you to use this stuff, is to have all the data sheets.
Yeah, because the current things are really working well for that. The old nefarious Grenville Tower. Anyway.
Yeah.
It's so difficult though, isn't it, when you're like, other things are sneaking through and you're like, let's try this thing that, on the surface looks like it's going to work out really well. In the meantime, someone's just put like a whole bunch of plastic and a bit of metal and stuck it on the outside with some flame, anyway. The yo-yoing of these questions are cracking me up. What has been the impact of CAD in your design process? Do you actually use it?
It's much more efficient. We use ArchiCAD in our office, which is a BIM, it's a bit like Revit, but the drawings look slightly better. Look, CAD is a tool. It's incredible. It's so powerful. We've had to really learn how to grapple it though, because this is always our concern, Rachel and my concern, and some of my other directors, is the way that software can lead you down certain paths which you may not otherwise have chosen to take. So there's still a lot of hand drawing in the practice to try and not just hand drawing, other ways of representing buildings to try and pull them back to where we want them to be. Look, ultimately, we're learning to live with it. It's amazing what it can do in terms of document production and quality. But you do have to learn to drive it so that you're driving it, it's not driving you, and that's a bit of a constant battle, I would say.
So when you talk about abstraction, this is not one of my questions. Is that when you're abstracting elements of things that you have observed and experienced in environments, is that a sketching process, or whichever way you come at it, whatever design tool? I'm just curious about because your proportion is so delicate.
We do it differently. Rachel is the most beautiful draftsperson. So she draws a lot, and she draws very early in projects. And I still use AutoCAD a lot because it's it really is two-dimensional drafting. It's like a drawing board, really. And I'm quite curious about specific proportions. So we use in the hotel, which was documented during the lockdown, Melbourne, the most lockdown city in the world, what a joy that was all documented during that. And I would draw on AutoCAD and then send the AutoCAD files off to the ArchiCAD drawers, and it would be transferred and it would go back and forward. So it just depends on. There was an element in one of those buildings we looked at, which I drew in the bus
Oh, yeah.
on the way driving around New Zealand earlier
good.
this year with you,
Oh,
and it was very crooked, and actually came out quite crooked too on the thing. So, yeah, I think we're part of our job is to communicate visually. So it's just there are a lot of architects in Australia from the Sydney School who will tell you have to use a specific type of pencil, and if you don't, there's something morally questionable about it. And I do not subscribe to that at all. I think there's lots of ways of communicating and drawing, and that all of them are valuable. I think even AI is interesting.
That's one of the questions down here.
Is it? Okay.
Are you using AI technologies in your practice? If yes, in which areas?
We're not using it, but I'm curious about it.
Well, want everyone to know how much data it uses and how bad that is for energy use in this world. Don't use it unless you absolutely have to.
Okay, maybe I won't use it.
Okay.
But it is fascinating because it is a way of encapsulating previous things. I don't get very excited by it, but I'm kind of curious about it as one tool amongst many.
Well, I'm curious to know if an AI, the approximation of the sketch on the abstraction is what I find, the amount that you covered in your lecture is so broad. And a lot of it's things that I've come to various conclusions, and we all have in our own way, but the way that you use abstraction in your space and texture making is, I just think, extraordinary. So that's why I was curious about your process.
It's imagination. I think this is the thing as architects, we all have to work on our imaginations all the time. And that's why we say to our colleagues, don't reference architecture from other architecture all the time. But you can do that, obviously. But we encourage them, get out in the world. Get interested in fashion or films or sport or food or just having fun and travelling. Just do all that stuff, because architecture at its best is representing the world at a point in time. So you can't do that. This is AI's problem. It's just referencing other architecture. It's boring, because what's interesting is when it's this synthesis of all of this other stuff. And this is why, if you look at the history of creative production in the world, it often comes from people with mental illnesses, because mental illness is this incredible thing where the brain bisects rational connections, and you get, beauty and newness, and I think, I'm not suggesting we all become mentally ill, but I think it's an interesting thing, and it's a valuable thing. We always think of mental illness as a negative thing, but actually there's something incredibly beautiful about it as well. But I think for all humans, just informing your creativity by being as in the world as possible is really useful. We talk about books a lot in our practice. We all read, and we spend a lot of time talking about what we're reading and what it means to us. And I feel like it's a very valuable thing for my architecture.
So I love that. There's a few books I need to recommend in terms of Aotearoa. The Axeman's Carnival was coming to mind. So this one's kind of related to that. In terms of culture in Aotearoa and Australia, do you feel we are both still developing a clear cultural identity in our built environment? Do you think we will ever reach one like other countries and continents, i.e. Europe? That's fascinating in relation to what you just said about it being a constantly moving feast.
See, I think it's interesting with European architecture. A lot of it's not very good. There are interesting places like Portugal and some of the Scandinavian countries, but it's almost like it's constrained by the weight of its history and by the fact that it's sort of past. I think all countries have productive peaks and troughs. I think in terms of settlement or newness, like New Zealand and Australia are quite young. I think we've got a long way to go. But I think any time a country gets to a point of stasis, that's not a good point to be at. So I think the growth is the exciting time. That's when the interesting things happen. And I think this thing about reconciliation and us getting to understand our First Nations people, I think it's also, to be quite selfish about it, it's also a fantastic opportunity for us, because these cultures are just incredible. Yours is way more embedded here than it is in Australia, but for us, we look at our Indigenous culture, it's 60,000 years old. It is a breathtaking culture, and it has just been completely disregarded. But we have, if we think of it as something we can get something from, which is not a very nice thing to say, but what I'm saying is actually the creativity that can come out of that is pretty exciting. So I think Australia and New Zealand, we need to tap into, the place, the country, and that will actually just improve our design culture.
Yeah, no, we've had a few in the jury experience. We talked a little bit about the kind of discomfort that comes with grappling with a different perspective that you haven't considered, and even within our relatively cultural tight background of the four of us, there was a lot of challenging conversations we had, but everyone was super open to it, and I think there was an excitement there. And that's where I get really excited about the possibilities here. And the tour just blew me out of the water, because there's no one way to do those things and have those conversations. But they're all being, not everywhere, of course, but in the small pool that we saw, it was so incredible to see the fire that's coming out of these, difficult conversations, but good conversations.
Yeah, I think we should all be looking to try and, rather than getting to a beautifully refined perfection, we should be looking at ways of challenging and disrupting that to find things which have newness and which are relevant to our time and our place, which are relevant to specific events.
So this says, has the COVID-19 pandemic changed your perception of design, and do you think it will impact what you design in the future?
Oh, look, probably. I mean, I'm a bit of an ostrich with this. I just loathed the COVID lockdowns. Some people seem to enjoy it. I really, really disliked it, and I'm a bit of a sort of retrospective denier. I just don't want to think about it. I just see it as a glitch. I think it's something we had to go through. It was awful, and now we can, that's a pretty glib answer. I mean, it has changed the way the world is, and there's no point in saying it's for the worse or for the better. It's just what happened, and we just have to get on with what we do now, using the knowledge that we got out of that, which is that we found out we could be incredibly resilient. It's actually remarkable what everyone in the world did. We all just went home and stayed there and did what we were told, and then these scientists in record-breaking speed made vaccines, and then we just inoculated the wealthy parts of the world. It was a remarkable thing. So I think we should take the good bits of it and just try and not think about the other bad bits.
They're also our bizarre way of keeping humans on the top of the pile. Vaccinations are.
Yeah.
Those parasites are trying to sort us out, and we're resisting. Thank you for your lecture. You speak with an infective optimism. How do you respond or deal with or process the overwhelming nature of our profession's interconnectedness? How about that for a question?
Okay, well, I think the interconnectedness thing is interesting because, we talk about the mental health of teenagers and young kids now, and it's pretty tough on them. They're in this social media world, which is pretty relentless. There's no quietness, there's no time to reflect, and attention spans have just been massively reduced. So it's hard for kids to read books now because their attention spans have been attenuated by social media. And I think for architecture it's hard too, because we live in this proliferation of imagery. We're constantly seeing imagery of each other's projects locally and across the world, and it actually, all that noise, all that visual noise and all that sort of ego, it makes it harder to be in a quiet space in your head, and it also makes it harder to be creative. I mean, I also say to my colleagues, try not to look sideways. Don't look what's happening over there. Just keep looking ahead and thinking, stay in your own head, because, ultimately what can happen with all of this connectedness is that architecture becomes like a giant Pinterest board. And people will say, oh, I like that, I'll have a bit of that, and I'll have a bit of that, and I'll put all that together, and these are this month's colours, and I'll make it all that colour, and Bob's your uncle. And that is just leached of any sort of specificity or meaning. And so I think that connectedness is a problem. It's also an amazing tool because it gives us access. If you want to use it, you can see things and be exposed to things and find out about things which previously were very difficult to access. So I don't know, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I'm not against it because it's a great tool and I use it. I really enjoy it. But I think we're all learning to use it. I think we're all learning to know what the right measure is of it. And we're not there yet because it's still relatively new.
Toby Morris has a really great cartoon where he draws a circle in the sand. This is one of our cartoonists, but he's like a political commentator as well. And he talks about everything coming at you and you draw your circle in the sand so it can all get to the circle and then you assess if you let it in or not. And that's the skill we need to be treating the kids.
Yep.
Is be like, you can filter it. You know, the world is coming at you, but you stop it there and let some of it in. Talking about circles, we see a lot of circular windows and openings in your projects. You talked about beauty and delight as well. Are you referencing anything in particular with these circular motifs?
Look, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's a Jungian thing, I don't know. With circles, often the reason why we use circles is because we have this tendency to make our buildings look a bit, we call them monsters. They sort of have this zoomorphic quality to them. And we do that because when we think about all the complex things a building has to do and all of, the different types of apertures and openings and rooms and so that they have to contain, to make it into a singular object, one of the ways we are inclined to use to do that is to make it into a thing, a creature. And that means often it will have eyes. So that's often the reason. There's probably a lot of other reasons, but for example, our hotel was always we called it the llama because it's got legs, brick legs and a brick neck and big eyes up the top. And so it was always called a llama and the team that worked on it were called the llamas. And in fact, there are llama sort of motifs all through the hotel, which was interesting because originally that hotel was going to be an ACE hotel and we went to New York and met with the people from ACE and Rachel had done this hilarious drawing of the hotel building and she'd drawn a llama over the top of it. And the American client said, "Oh, we don't like our buildings to look like animals. We like our buildings to look like buildings." And the relationship didn't go very well and it's not an ACE hotel now.
Yeah, I really have appreciated your sense of humour because at the end of the day, we need hilarity to get through all the madness. And so I love that you bring that to the built realm. That's very cool.
Well, it's better than the American architect Stanley Tigerman. He used to put a penis on all of his buildings. So that's sort of problematic, I think.
Well, people used to say all the city buildings were doing that anyway. Okay, what do you say to students entering the profession now who may feel discouraged or disillusioned by the nature of the economy or practice today? That's our last question. Quite a big one.
Oh, look, I don't know. I mean, I guess you say to them,
go watch a movie.
Yeah,
read a book.
think very seriously about embarking on this profession. It's changing, and we don't know what the answers are. But I mean, I have spent a lecture defending the professionalism of what we do, and why it's a valuable and important profession, and why it needs to be more than just a transactional job. But it is really, really hard. And so I think one of the good things about young people today is that they don't really necessarily need to approach jobs like vocations. And so I would suggest that they just keep an open mind about it and work out what the best area of practice for them is. I mean, they're not going to be like, Mike Brady and carry a drawing roll under their arm for the rest of their lives. It's not going to be that kind of job anymore. But, you're equipped to do so many other things. So, you can move into other areas. So I would just say, just take the best of it, but don't feel limited by it too. Make sure you keep your options open because there's so much you can do with the training and sensibility that our profession will give you.
It's good to try out all the aspects of our profession, isn't it? Because I've never seen such a broad church of a job. Basically you can be a PR obsessive, you can be a research boffin, you can be like supremely technical or like very generalist, and you can find a space for yourself. So that's the fun part of our job, I think. Thank you.
Indeed.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.